You don't even notice the moment your life stops belonging to you, because the habits you hate didn't feel like choices when you made them. You think you choose your life, but most of what you do is just a repetition of old emotional programming pretending to be free will. People walk into jobs they hate, relationships that drain them, habits that disgust them, and they call it maturity or responsibility when it's actually unconscious obedience. But the disturbing truth is that you don't wake up one day and decide to betray yourself. You slowly adjust to the pain until you can't tell the difference between familiarity and choice. You convince yourself you're being practical, stable, realistic. But deep down, there's a voice whispering that you're living someone else's script, not your own. And the strange part is that you ignore that voice not because you're weak, but because you learned a long time ago that listening to yourself leads to conflict, consequences, and change you weren't ready for. So you repeat the same choices, not out of desire, but out of psychological muscle memory, the kind that hides in the background while convincing you that you're acting consciously. This is why people stay in cycles that slowly suffocate their identity while saying, "I'm fine," even though their inner dialogue is screaming, "I don't want this life anymore." The mind protects what feels familiar, even when familiar is killing you. And you don't question it, because questioning feels like betrayal of the version of you that survived the past. But here's the uncomfortable truth you try to avoid. You don't hate your choices. You hate the invisible rules controlling them. You hate the expectations you never questioned, the standards you didn't choose, the fears that were handed to you like inheritance, and yet you carry them as if they belong to you. And while you tell yourself you're doing what you should, there's a quieter truth underneath. You're terrified of removing the structures that give you identity, even if that identity is slowly destroying you. So you keep performing the version of you that people recognize, because losing that version feels more dangerous than living a life that quietly suffocates you every single day. Now, you don't even notice the moment your life stops belonging to you, because the habits you hate didn't feel like choices when you made them. You don't notice how the things you hate become the things you do automatically, because the mind is built to conserve energy, not pursue truth. Your brain would rather repeat a miserable routine than confront a possibility that demands emotional risk. That's why you wake up and perform the same patterns, even when you silently whisper, "I don't want this anymore." You tell yourself you'll change tomorrow, next week, next month, once things calm down. But the real reason you delay is because the identity you built around survival is terrified of being exposed. You weren't taught self-trust, you were taught compliance, taught to keep the peace, taught to avoid being a problem. So when you start doing things that crush your spirit, you reinterpret the suffocation as responsibility, maturity, or sacrifice, because admitting the truth, "I'm afraid to choose differently," feels like a confession you're not ready to make. And while you go through the motions, your inner dialogue keeps repeating the same quiet accusation. You know this isn't you. You know you're pretending. How long are you going to keep doing this? But instead of listening, you distract yourself with routines, commitments, and obligations until numbing becomes your default state. And here's the pattern interrupt you've avoided. You don't hate what you do. You hate that you never learned how to act without seeking permission. You hate that your instincts were dismissed, that your desires were minimized, that your discomfort was labeled as dramatic or unreasonable. So now when you feel a pull towards something unfamiliar, you interpret it as danger, not possibility. You protect the life you resent because at least it makes sense. At least it doesn't demand you face the version of yourself you've buried under years of adaptive behavior. The tragic part is that you've become so skilled at functioning in emotional autopilot that you mistake survival for stability. And even when a part of you wants to break away, another part whispers, "But what if I fail? What if I lose everything? What if choosing myself ruins what's already barely holding together?" That hesitation becomes your cage, and you decorate it with excuses until it feels like home. But deep down, you know it isn't. You keep doing things you hate because your mind confuses repetition with safety, and safety with identity. This is the trap. The more familiar a pattern becomes, the more your brain insists it's who you are. So even when something inside you protests, even when your chest tightens with that silent warning, "This isn't the life you want," You override it because the discomfort of change feels more threatening than the misery you already understand. You tell yourself you're being rational, but the truth is that you're emotionally conditioned. Your past trained you to minimize your own needs, to tolerate discomfort, to ignore your intuition, and now that conditioning shows up as decisions that look voluntary but aren't. And while you're performing your daily routines, there's a private conversation happening in the background of your mind that you pretend not to hear. It says, "Why are you still here? Why didn't you walk away? What are you so afraid of losing?" You try to silence those questions because they expose something you don't want to see. You're attached to the very things you despise because they shield you from confronting who you could be without them. And here's the truth you keep dodging. You don't fear change. You fear the responsibility that comes after change. You fear the moment you can't blame circumstances, parents, partners, society, or timing anymore. Because if you actually stopped doing what you hate, you'd have to ask, what do I want? And that question terrifies you more than the routines that suffocate you. So instead, you numb yourself with predictable choices, convincing yourself that it's just a phase, or temporary, or necessary, while the real consequence quietly grows. Every day you delay your own life, you reinforce the belief that you don't deserve something better. This is the silent damage, the erosion of self-worth that happens not dramatically, but slowly, through hundreds of small betrayals you pretend are harmless. And one day, you look at yourself and wonder why you feel disconnected, why everything feels dull, why nothing excites you anymore. It's because you've trained your mind to survive your own life instead of live it, and survival eventually becomes a prison with invisible walls you stop trying to escape. You don't realize how deeply you've internalized the idea that suffering is normal, even respectable. Somewhere along the line, you learned that discomfort is the price of being a good person, a responsible adult, a stable human being. So when you feel drained, resentful, or trapped, you don't interpret it as a sign to change. You interpret it as a sign to endure. This is why you stay in routines that shrink you, habits that numb you, relationships that exhaust you. You tell yourself you're being loyal, committed, disciplined, when really you're just repeating a script that was handed to you long before you had the power to question it. The most dangerous part is that you confuse exhaustion with effort. You think the heaviness you feel is proof you're doing the right thing, so you ignore the tension in your body, the frustration in your thoughts, the dull ache in your spirit that whispers, "This is not your life." And in those quiet moments before you fall asleep, your inner dialogue becomes brutally honest. How long are you going to pretend this is okay? How many years are you willing to sacrifice to avoid one moment of confrontation with yourself? But instead of listening, you wake up the next day and return to the same patterns, because breaking them feels like breaking your identity. Here's the pattern interrupt you've avoided. You don't continue the things you hate because you're incapable of changing. You continue them because you're emotionally addicted to the version of yourself who survived by pleasing, enduring, and adjusting. Letting go of that version feels like betrayal, even if keeping it means destroying your future. And the longer you stay, the more you lose. Not dramatically, but quietly. You lose your intuition first, then your enthusiasm, then your ambition, and finally, your ability to imagine something different. The tragedy is that you mistake the slow fading of your potential for maturity. You keep telling yourself you're fine because admitting the truth would require action, but deep down, something is cracking each time you choose familiarity over freedom. You feel it, you deny it, but you know something inside you is reaching its limit, and the frightening part is that you don't know who you'll be when it finally breaks. You keep doing things you hate because you've built your entire emotional system around avoiding internal conflict. You learned to silence your instincts before you ever learned to understand them, and now that silence feels like peace, even when it's actually self-abandonment. Every time you feel that small pull inside, leave this, stop this, change this, you immediately counter it with a defensive thought you've repeated so often it feels like truth. It's not the right time. I can't afford to mess this up. People are counting on me. But those aren't reasons. They're shields. They protect you from the discomfort of admitting that the life you're maintaining is one you never consciously chose. And the terrifying part is that your mind has become skilled at hiding the cost. It tells you you're being practical, responsible, realistic, while quietly draining the parts of you that once dreamed freely. You stop noticing the way your shoulders tense when you think about your daily routine, the way your energy collapses when someone asks if you're doing okay, the way your thoughts drift into fantasies of escape you immediately dismiss as childish. But the deeper truth is this: the things you hate aren't random. They're mirrors. They reflect the parts of your identity you've neglected, suppressed, or sacrificed. And the longer you ignore those reflections, the more distorted you become. There's a moment, maybe you've felt it, when you look at yourself and realize you've become a predictable machine, not a conscious human. You perform, you repeat, you endure, and somewhere in the background a voice whispers, "This can't be it. This can't be all there is." Yet you still don't move, because movement requires one thing you've spent your entire life avoiding: disappointing the expectations that were placed on you before you could understand their weight. Here's the truth you keep dodging. You're not trapped by circumstances. You're trapped by the fear of being seen as someone who chooses differently. You're afraid of the judgment, the confusion, the resistance that comes when you break the pattern everyone benefits from, except you. So you stay, you tolerate, you shrink. And every day, the gap between who you are and who you pretend to be widens just enough for you to feel the pain, but not enough for you to act, yet. You keep doing things you hate because you've built a life that requires your absence to function. You've created routines, obligations, and expectations that only work as long as you don't show up as your real self. The moment you express a true want, a boundary, a desire for change, everything you've constructed begins to wobble, and that instability terrifies you more than the quiet misery you tolerate. So you shrink yourself to keep the structure standing. You silence every impulse that threatens the image people have of you. And while you go through the motions, a private truth grows louder inside you. If I ever acted like who I really am, none of this would survive. That thought alone is enough to keep you obedient. You weren't trained to build a life that fits you. You were trained to fit into a life that benefits others. And because of that, every time you try to change a pattern, you feel guilt instead of freedom. You feel fear instead of possibility. You feel selfish for wanting what was always yours to begin with. But here's the harsh reality you've avoided. The things you hate doing aren't the real problem. The real problem is the identity you've created around being someone who never disrupts anything. Your entire sense of self is built on not making waves, not disappointing anyone, not risking rejection. And that identity is starving you slowly. You lose your spark, your curiosity, your edge. You become emotionally flat, mentally exhausted, spiritually numb. You start living in a constant state of almost resentment, pretending you're fine while something inside you whispers, "This is killing you," piece by piece. But you ignore it, because acknowledging it would force you to take responsibility. And responsibility is terrifying when you've spent your life avoiding your own power. So you cling to routines that feel safe, because they require nothing from you. Not courage, not honesty, not self-respect. And somewhere deep down, you know that every day you stay in this cycle, you're teaching yourself that your comfort matters less than other people's expectations. That belief is the real prison, and you're the one reinforcing the bars every time you pretend you don't feel the suffocation closing in. You keep doing things you hate because you've never paused long enough to confront the truth that terrifies you most. You are the only one who can ruin or rebuild your life, and taking ownership of that level of power feels dangerous, almost unbearable, because it exposes every excuse you've relied on to justify staying stuck. So instead of facing that truth, you cling to routines that drain you, environments that cage you, habits that numb you, because they allow you to postpone the moment you finally admit, "This is my responsibility now." You've spent so long adapting, adjusting, and absorbing expectations that the idea of choosing for yourself feels like dismantling the foundation your entire identity sits on. And maybe that's exactly what it is. You tell yourself you're confused or unsure or not ready, but deep down you know the real reason. Change would require a version of you who can no longer hide behind history, circumstance, or the comfort of being predictable. It would require a version of you who stops performing the character everyone is used to, the one who keeps things smooth, stable, and familiar even when it eats you alive. And in the quietest moments, when you're staring at the ceiling before sleep or zoning out in the middle of a routine you despise, your inner voice becomes brutally clear. You know what needs to change. You're just afraid of what that change will expose. And it's right. Taking back your life means confronting the truth that you've been complicit. Not because you're weak, but because you were never taught how to exist without permission. You kept waiting for a sign, for support, for clarity, for the perfect moment, but those were delays disguised as logic. Here's the final pattern interrupt. You're not stuck. You're comfortable. And comfort is the slowest form of self-destruction. The longer you stay loyal to a life that drains you, the more you confirm a belief you never wanted, that you're someone who settles. So here is the challenge: uncomfortable, immediate, unavoidable. Before the next hour passes, remove one obligation, one habit, or one routine you hate. Not tomorrow, not tonight, now. Do something that disrupts your autopilot, even slightly, and watch how quickly your mind exposes every fear you've been hiding behind. That's where the real work begins.